roster pieces are still falling into place, and things are going to continue to follow that trend as we move into training camps for every NHL team. But for today, I've got a little rabbit hole that I want to go down because the Calgary Flames signed Tyson Barrie to a PTO, and you're probably thinking, that's great, so what? But the Calgary Flames made a series of moves last year that could be early indications of a rebuild, and a Barrie PTO is more likely than not an indication that the Flames will have a different defenseman to move out. We'll talk about who those defensemen might be and what that could mean for the Edmonton Oilers, but let's talk about it after you do what just 11% of our viewers do, and that's hit the subscribe button to support the channel. Okay, so the Flames are signing Tyson Barrie to a PTO. He's an ex-Oiler, and plenty of players who end up signing PTOs only play for that team during that preseason. Of course, that's what a PTO is. You sign to try out during the preseason, during training camp, and then you have the option to sign a permanent contract afterwards, or the team can release you. So every year you see guys go into teams for training camps and don't end up sticking around for the long haul. So we're analyzing this based on the fact that Tyson Barrie signed a PTO in Calgary. He could very, very well not make the Calgary Flames, but I have a feeling he will. Calgary have, I'd say, a weaker than average blue line, but I think very importantly what the Calgary Flames are right now is a team in transition. I think the early signs of the rebuild that Calgary started last year are great. That is exactly what the Flames need to do. This group of players, the group of players that was left behind after the Matthew Tkachuk trade to Florida, is not going to win, period. It's not going to happen. You are going to need superstars coming up from the youth ranks. That is how you build a contending team. Look at the Edmonton Oilers. They didn't trade for Connor McDavid. They didn't sign Leon Draisaitl as a free agent. Evan Bouchard, McDavid, Draisaitl, go down the list, Nugent-Hopkins, all this, Stuart Skinner, all these players were drafted. Calgary need to build a team in the same manner. But right now, with the players they have, that means a rebuild. Edmonton Oilers fans are very familiar with what a rebuild is, are they not? Well, Calgary signing Tyson Barrie to a PTO is being done to fill the roster spot that current roster players are going to leave when they are traded. There is no reason right now that 27-year-old Rasmus Andersson and 30-year-old MacKenzie Weegar should not be moved from the Calgary Flames to a contending team unless Calgary just isn't getting anything close to a reasonable offer for either player. That's because the Calgary Flames are very, very much in a spot right now that a rebuild makes exponentially more sense than trying to load up with talent and compete for a playoff spot. So Rasmus Andersson and MacKenzie Weegar are the two defensemen I'm talking about here for Calgary that could go to Edmonton. These are two players, man, that you never really see available on the market. How often does a right shot defenseman of this caliber come up in trade talks? And let's start with Rasmus Andersson here, because I want to say who these players are before I talk about, and again, I can hear the keyboards being typed that why am I talking about the Edmonton Oilers trading for a defenseman when they have no cap space? But I'll get to all that eventually. I just want to start by talking about who these players are. Let's go with what I'll call the less attractive but far more feasible option, and that's Rasmus Andersson. If you ask me for not for a name, but for me to describe the type of player that Edmonton needs right now for this roster, I'd probably describe something close to what Rasmus Andersson is, a strong two-way defenseman who can move the puck well and contribute 5-on-5. Andersson, worth mentioning, makes just over $4.5 million a season. He's got this year and next year left on his contract. Again, I'll get to the money, so wait on that. It's very often difficult to objectively analyze players on opposing teams, but especially players on your rival. So it shouldn't be news to anyone whether Oilers fans kind of see this with these two Calgary Flames players or not. But Rasmus Andersson and MacKenzie Weegar are both excellent hockey players. We're talking about Andersson right now. He's an effective and reliable play killer, and he rarely makes defensive zone mistakes. Over the last 3 seasons, Andersson's managed to average 8 goals and 38 assists a year, which is a great output from a guy who has never really been offense first in his career. The Calgary Flames, specifically this Flames group, don't really transition the puck all too well, and really that's the one thing of Andersson's game where I've seen gaps in. Is I'd love to see him more engaged when the puck is being moved from south to north, as they say, in terms of the Calgary Flames getting the puck from defense to offense. I'd love to see him more involved, not just with driving that puck out of the zone, but with being an option, making a 3-man forward rush, a 4-man forward rush, something like that. He doesn't do that all too much, but Calgary as a team don't do that well at all. It's not something that they seem to focus on enough, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. So criticizing Andersson for not doing something that's more on the team than on him is maybe a little bit unfair. I'll talk about the other factors such as the money. It's coming. But before that, I'm going to talk about what the big prize out of Calgary has to be. It's MacKenzie Weegar. The only issue I really have with Weegar over the last 5 seasons has been kind of an inability to remain consistently elite. But when he's on, MacKenzie Weegar is one of the most underrated defensemen in the NHL. Casual fans will see Weegar's stats and think that the 2023-24 season was a breakout. Think that season was an anomaly. And I guess, yes, when you look at this, 20 goals for MacKenzie Weegar is an anomaly for his career. But the quality of hockey that MacKenzie Weegar played last year in Calgary was absolutely not an anomaly. Weegar has been a reliable two-way top 4 defenseman for years now, and I know that the Florida Panthers just won the Stanley Cup, but there was a time, and the time was only a couple years ago, that people really didn't think of the Florida Panthers as all too relevant. They were good, but prior to the Tkachuk trade, they really weren't contenders, and they were overshadowed by Tampa Bay. So MacKenzie Weegar was able to carve out a role in Florida as their number 1 defenseman, even thanks to multiple injuries to Aaron Ekblad. And it was almost like nobody really noticed. He was the stalwart on the back for Florida for so long. So for him to move to Calgary and all of a sudden become just the 11th active NHL defenseman to score 20 goals in a season, all that really tells me is he got an opportunity in Calgary that he didn't get in Florida, because this has been a top-level player for a long time. Much like Andersson, Weegar is able to keep the defensive mistakes to an absolute minimum. And as good as Weegar is offensively, it's rare that I see him make a play and think that he is prioritizing the offensive side of his game incorrectly, where the defense should be the priority. He only ever really activates and drives offense forward himself when it's the right time to do so. He's an incredibly smart defenseman. And now I've been gushing about these 2 Flames defensemen the whole time, and again, I heard it already, and no doubt the comments are writing about how there is no way that the Edmonton Oilers are going to be able to make the salary cap work, and I understand it. And that's kind of the point here at the end of this video. Both players would make great additions to the Oilers, but massively, money is going to be hard. Right now, Edmonton are only $170,000 shy of the salary cap maximum, which means that if Edmonton make a trade in the current moment, it would have to kind of be a straight swap on the money front, same amount in as go out. And I'll tell you right now, that kneecaps Edmonton's chances at MacKenzie Weegar, for a couple reasons. First, he's got a higher cap hit, but perhaps more importantly, he's got a much longer contract than Andersson. NHL teams, for a variety of reasons, don't just retain salary on a player as if it doesn't matter to them. Teams can only have 3 players having money retained at a time, and importantly, Calgary retained just over 30% of Jacob Markstrom's contract when they sent him to New Jersey, which means that the Calgary Flames would only have 2 more spots left to retain salary, and that's something you do want to save if you're Calgary, because when the NHL trade deadline comes, you can make a deal for either one of your good players, or we've seen so many times teams that aren't in the playoffs use the salary cap they have to take a piece of another player happening in another trade, where a team that's acquiring a player might need 75% of that player to be retained, much like Edmonton had to do with Adam Henrique last year. Well, Calgary could get a draft pick out of taking a little bit of salary retention just for the season. So that's not to say that Calgary wouldn't retain a dime in any trade. That's not true. But asking them to take a chunk, let alone a 50% chunk of a $6 million contract until 2031 is absolutely an unreasonable and unrealistic thing to expect or to ask for. I'll say it directly because this is what I'm saying. There is absolutely no way that Calgary are retaining any sort of substantial portion of MacKenzie Weegar's contract. It is not going to happen. It's as much because of the money as it is because Calgary would have 7 years worth of that money on their books coming off their cap and being paid to a player that isn't playing for them. They're not going to do that. Rasmus Andersson, on the other hand, only has 2 years left on a deal that'll pay him just over $4.5 million a season. Asking a team to retain just around $2.25 million this year and next year isn't a lot to ask, let alone ask a team that would be best served to dive headfirst into a rebuild the way Calgary should be right now. Now, accepting the hypothetical that Calgary would be able to retain on Andersson, Edmonton would be in the pretty manageable position of needing to free over just $2 million in cap space to add Andersson. And I'm kind of the opinion that you can solve, and you can arguably easily be solving that problem as part of the trade with Calgary. Because in the event that Andersson's coming with some retention, what if it was Brett Kulak, for instance, that would go back the other way? With the Kulak money being just $2.75 million on this contract for Kulak, Calgary would only need to retain 40% of Andersson to make it work, and the Oilers would be able to make it work without involving a third team or relying on some other factors like LTIR. And for somebody like Brett Kulak, Calgary obviously gets a usable number 5-6 NHL defenseman in return for Andersson, but Brett Kulak would also be the kind of player that the Calgary Flames could then turn around and flip at the trade deadline for a draft pick or two. Kulak is an effective defenseman. I think a lot of NHL teams would like to have him on their bottom pair, or if not, if he's available, why not add an extra number 7 depth piece? I think Calgary could use Kulak in a trade, but then could also easily get something for him if they're thinking in the abstract and thinking that they're going to then flip him later on in the season. The last thing I want to implore everybody to consider here is the market. Affordable two-way right shot defenseman being available will inevitably draw interest from the entire league, specifically when you remember that the reigning Pacific Division champions need the help on defense probably more than the Oilers do. I'd say that it's far more likely that it gets harder from here to make a deal for Edmonton. It's not going to be easier in November or December, I think, to get this trade done. I think if Edmonton thinks that their defense core right now, which I will remind you, Daily Faceoff has as this. So if the Edmonton Oilers think that this defense needs to be upgraded in order to win the Stanley Cup, which, yeah, it does, trying to make something work right now is probably their best bet, especially if it's going to be a substantial addition like a Rasmus Andersson. You could see the Band-Aid acquisition at the trade deadline, at number 5-6, who is just adding depth. Yeah, you can make those trades whenever. If you're talking about a bona fide top 4 defenseman, the kind of trade that you look back on and you say, I don't know if we would have won the Stanley Cup without making that trade. That's what the Edmonton Oilers have at their disposal right now. We will obviously see what the asking price is for these two players. Not to mention, I've laid out this Brett Kulak salary retention scheme as if it's this very, very easy thing to pull off. And if traversing the salary cap has, taught us anything since the salary cap's inception, nothing is easy. So we'll obviously see, but I'm very excited for this season to come. No matter who's on the Oilers defense, Matt Pierce, Kirk Day, and I are going to have all of the coverage on Oilers Digest, so please hit that subscribe button. Have a great day.